Welcome in, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to file in and get situated, and then I'll kick it back over to Russell and Melissa to get us started. All right, guys, I think we're in a good place here to get started whenever you're ready.
Right. I guess still good morning for me, but good afternoon for some of you. Appreciate everybody being here. We're going to get a chance to talk a little bit about the new development landscape that's been created through some of the legislative changes that have happened in the last legislative session. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with a little bit of why we're here, and then we're going to go through some of these legislative changes and what this means for the folks on the call, developers or engineers, and how this might impact you moving forward. Again, we appreciate you guys being with us today. Just a quick introduction. I'm Russell Yeager. I'm the Vice President of Civil Engineering here for our central region across Texas, which is obviously what we're talking about today, and the central U.S. And I have with me Melissa McKinley, who is our Government Affairs Director. Melissa, I don't know if you want to add anything in.
Sure. Good morning to you all in Texas. I'm currently at our headquarters in West Palm Beach, Florida, so it's afternoon for me. But happy to be here and doing this presentation with my good friend Russell. And also, I love never being the smartest person in the room when I'm surrounded by engineers. So good morning to all of you.
So Melissa will be adding in me a little bit of engineering take, her political take on how we got here and what things are going on. As we move forward, if you guys have questions, feel free to add them into the chat. Our illustrious team here will pipe in and ask us those at the end of the presentation, but we definitely look forward to questions as we move through the presentation today. A little bit about WGI. These are our locations. We're, obviously, as you can see, throughout the South United States, Chicago and Illinois, but we're talking about Texas today. We have offices across the state of Texas to serve projects, multidiscipline projects anywhere here in the state. And obviously our ties to the state are long and been working here for over 15 years with WGI. So a lot of opportunities for us to talk about how these changes are going to impact both past, current, and future projects. So if you do have questions that are specific, feel free to put those in the chat as well. If for some reason we don't get to them, we can call you back or shoot you a note afterwards and make sure we can answer those. But let's get started here. What is driving these legislative changes? So for the most part, for those of you who are, a lot of you are probably here in Texas, I'm sure you have lived through the decades at this point of unprecedented growth here. Although some have said that it has slowed, we're still the fastest growing state in the nation, or at least large state. A lot of growth is still here. That growth continues to put a strain on our infrastructure, but particularly you will see in the coming slides that a couple of the main areas that the state looked at making adjustments is in the areas of housing and ensuring that we have the right infrastructure on the electric side. And these were areas that were specifically strained over the last few years, both from people moving in for housing, but also people moving in seeking new positions for their companies. Data centers has been a big topic of discussion, but the bottlenecks that we've seen the state try and step in is to try and limit the restrictions that zoning has created for projects. They continue to work at the state level to try and speed up the development and permitting processes, and they're doing their best as they can from the legislature of it, attempting to impact the rising land and construction costs. And why this matters is in the 2025 legislative session, had a number of reforms that we'll talk about today, some that are still ongoing. But again, they're working to try and create more flexibility, break down barriers, cut red tape, create as much certainty as they can in the process. For those of you who are developing regularly, some of these projects may take 2 or 3 or 5 years to complete, and the regulatory changes over that time can really negatively impact a project. And so there's some attempt at creating some certainty and some longevity for projects, and then obviously just creating smarter opportunities for housing. Throughout the session, just a couple little notes. We're not going to talk about all of these, obviously, but there's nearly 2,000 bills that were passed over the last legislative session. We're going to talk about 5 or 6 of them today that really impact what we're doing, what we're doing here in our space. But a busy session. And I'll turn over to Melissa. I don't know if you want to add anything there from the session or your understanding from the politics side of what's happened in this last session.
Thanks, Russell. I just want to add that these changes that we're seeing in trying to remove these regulatory barriers aren't, they're not just Texas alone. We're seeing this movement across the country. I know here in Florida, a lot of the legislation that we're going to talk about that passed in Texas is already in place in much of Florida. So it's a national conversation. And as a former elected official, I think one of the greatest barriers we have isn't necessarily regulatory. It's what we call NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Everybody wants affordable housing. They want workforce housing, but they don't want it in their backyard. And so what you're seeing the legislature do is try to remove some of those political barriers for local elected officials as well. But it's a fine balance, right? Because we have to have our relationships with our local elected officials. When we bring these projects before a county commission or a city council, we need to make sure that we have those relationships and they don't feel like we're trying to walk all over them. So watching how the legislature navigates this in the near future is going to be, it's going to be watched closely. So I think what you're going to see in a lot of these bills is a lot of the public testimony that took place had industry on one side and had local government on the opposition side. And you'll see that just as local governments fight to protect their home rule authority. So those are some of the challenges we face, but a lot of these bills that pass were meant to reduce those regulatory barriers and kind of take out the pressure from the neighbors in the surrounding neighborhoods who don't necessarily want to see change coming. So we're going to go through a few bills here. The first one, you can see this is going to be our quick agenda, sort of legislation 101 in less than an hour. We're going to start with HB 24 and talk about Senate Bill 840, then 1883, Senate Bill 15, and Senate Bill 6. Certainly these aren't, as Russell mentioned already, the only bills that passed during session, but these are some of the major pieces of legislation that affect how developers do business in the state of Texas. The first one we're going to talk about is House Bill 24, easing your zoning protest barriers. As you can see that we've been operating under the same rules for decades. I'd like to joke that when I looked at this the other day, decades means 1927. So for nearly 100 years, the zoning protest rules and regulations that have been in effect in Texas haven't been changed. The previous rules required that 20% of adjacent landowners who protested any zoning regulation changes, it only took 20%, and that triggered a requirement by the local elected body that they would have to pass these zoning regulation changes by a supermajority vote by 3/4 of that elected body. Some of those thresholds remain in place. However, there was a significant change that would allow for a simple majority to pass those legislative changes. There are 3 different options now for protests. The first one is owners of 20% of the area of lots or lands covered by the proposed change would trigger a 3/4 supermajority vote, or owners of 20% immediately adjoining the land area proposed by the change and extending 200 feet from that area also would continue to require a supermajority vote. The big change that we're seeing is when you've got owners of at least 60% of the area of lots or lands immediately adjacent to the property and extending for 200 feet, now would only require a simple majority vote of the elected body if the proposed change has the effect of allowing more residential development than the current regulations, and it does not add additional commercial or industrial uses unless those uses are limited to the first floor and only take up 35% of the overall project. So this is going to allow a simplified process for some of your multifamily projects and some of your mixed use projects to come in and maybe redevelop some areas that haven't been able to be redeveloped. In addition, there have been some changes on how that 20% ownership requirement is met. It allows for streets and alleys, those land areas, to be included in the overall measurement of the affected land area. It also adds a presumption of validity, which basically is any proposed change allowing for more residential development than the previous regulations is presumed to be valid in accordance with all state law if nobody has moved to invalidate or annul that before the 60th day after the effective date. So basically, you're presumed to be within the rules and regulations, and you can move forward with your project. There are also in this legislation a lot of language that clarifies and adds new requirements, kind of easing them, making them a little bit easier for advertising and posting of proposed changes. And these laws went into effect on September 1st. Russell, you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one note too is a lot of the development that we're seeing is starting to push out of the larger municipalities into some of these small, what I would call suburban or edge of rural developments where you may have a much smaller council. And so one of the things that we're looking for is, as this is applied, is to see how it impacts these councils or maybe county commissions that have just 3 to 5 members instead of a large 10-member board, where previously a supermajority meant you have to get 4 out of 5, and now it's 3 out of 5, and that may make a big difference in some of these particularly smaller areas as well.
Right.
But nothing outside there. Go ahead.
It also, as you can see here on this slide, I don't want to read through each of those bullets, but it's certainly meant to allow for developers and lenders and planners to actually have a more predictable environment in which to operate, reduces that NIMBYism, as I mentioned earlier, and really will allow for those infill and those redevelopment projects to maybe move forward. And the benefit of that is kind of reducing that urban sprawl and being able to add these projects where infrastructure already exists.
All right, and we're going to move on to Senate Bill 840, which is the by right conversion of underused commercial sites. This one is a really unique provision that a couple things to look at initially is it's bracketed to cities with 150,000 people and then counties of 300,000 or more. And that really impacts about 17 major cities around the state of Texas. Everything from Houston on one end all the way to Denton, up in Dallas, the Dallas area. But there are a number of towns that won't be impacted by this. So just as you're looking at your projects, we'll need to look at this bracketing first to see if we're in this threshold. The second thing to take a look at is that this is excluded within 3,000 feet of airports or military facilities, or heavy industrial, which we'll talk about what is heavy industrial here in a little bit, because that is an area of interpretation. But if you're 3,000 feet is pretty close to an airport or to a military base, in most of those cases, there are plans to generally try and keep denser housing away from those facilities just because of the safety reasons. So you'll see that those things kind of cap the areas that this can be effective in. But this does open up a lot of property opportunities where, over the last few years, commercial has maybe been less valuable to a community. In certain cases, maybe an office that's no longer viable, that they want to be converted into multifamily, now can be done in these cases by right, which is a really significant change and a reduction in the amount of effort that will have to go into those conversions. They're already very difficult as it is, and so to be able to make them more effective from an entitlement standpoint is really critical. So a few areas just to note is the multifamily in this bill is defined as 3 units or more on any given property. So it doesn't mean you have to use the maximum density that's available, but it does mean that in order to make the conversion, it's 3 or more units. The cities, by the way that this is created, must allow their highest residential density. So in many cases, there are densities that are rarely used, 65 units per acre or more, that will be available to these properties that are often very difficult to get an independent zoning designation for. So it makes even a small commercial site uniquely positioned to provide a dense project to create a supply of housing in some of these communities that desperately need it. So in order to be considered for this, you also have to have at least 65% of the floor area being residential. So it could be a mixed use project where you keep the first floor or maybe even 2 floors of commercial in an existing building or a new construction, but 65% or higher must stay residential. So the goal here is still to try and increase the amount of housing that is available. There's a number of things that are waived in this. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but you could see them here, but we'll talk a little bit more about those in the next slide. But really, this is geared towards being focused on current zonings like office, general commercial, retail, or light warehouse areas that this should apply and give opportunity for as of right transitions into housing. Now, one of the difficult I say the language that needs some interpretation in the bill is the term heavy industrial, where you have to say 3,000 feet away from that. It is not it's not necessarily defined in the bill. So, looking into how a municipality is going to define heavy industrial is going to be really critical if you're looking at using this as of right conversion. That in most cases means manufacturing uses or other, heavy distribution uses, and oftentimes in municipal codes that they're already defined as heavy industrial. But if that's not previously defined, it's something to make sure that we're watching with the municipalities that are taking these state laws and applying them locally. You can see here that there's a number of controls. The state wants to ensure that that cities don't take this standard, and we'll talk about another standard later, and then create other hurdles, other red tape that make them very difficult to use. So in addition, they've lessened or made easier the local controls on height, setbacks, parking, floor area ratios, or impervious cover restrictions. So when these are being redeveloped, the cities are limited on how they apply those other things, include those other regulations, and traffic studies and parking as well. So in some cities where the parking standards are high, the state has capped this at these transitions need to have at least 1 parking space per unit. And in many cities around the state of Texas, the parking ratios for a new project are upwards of 1, sometimes 1.5, sometimes even 2. So this gives you an opportunity to be focused on reduced parking in certain, maybe in a transit-oriented zone or other places where public transportation is available. So when we look at the housing, the heights, the minimum current zone, the minimums for heights according to the state code are going to be at the current zoning or 45 feet, whichever one is greater. And the setbacks would be the same as the current zoning or at 25 feet, whichever is greater. So that would, whichever is less, whether it's the current zoning or at a maximum 45 feet for height or setbacks at 25 feet, which again makes sure that you can still maximize the site for residential. But what this really focuses on and why it matters is in a lot of the infill areas in our communities, there are vacant office parks or strip malls or potential big box retail sites that have become underutilized, or in some cases maybe even a blight, that have had a hard time transitioning into housing due to maybe restrictive zoning or difficult zoning cases, or in some cases the transition from one to the other creates non-compliant uses in the areas of parking or height or other things that we just talked about. So the intention is to reduce those roadblocks and provide an opportunity for these underutilized spaces to become effective, particularly affordable housing for communities, and particularly in the adaptive reuse space across towns. So, Melissa, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on some of the good news bullets that Russell mentioned. These conversion projects will just want to go over the things that they will no longer be required to do. Developers doing these projects, you won't be required to do traffic impact analyses or studies. You won't be required for the construction of improvements or payment in lieu connected to any traffic mitigation effects. You won't be required to provide any additional parking spaces or parking garages beyond what currently exists at the site already. You won't be required to construct extensions, upgrades, replacements, or oversizing utility facilities beyond what would be required to serve your proposed conversion project. You won't be required or held by any design requirements related to the building exteriors, the windows, the internal building environment, or the interior space dimensions of those individual apartments. The really big one, you won't be required to pay impact fees beyond what the original project required. And you also, they won't be able to collect local governments any roadway improvement impact fees on land within extraterritorial jurisdiction of affected political subdivisions. So big savings for developers who are doing these conversion projects, and a win-win to the neighborhoods that are going to get them, because you won't have these vacant underutilized spaces anymore.
Thanks, Melissa.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we're going to talk about locking in impact fees. We just talked about what a benefit it is to not pay them in this last bill. But even on new projects, the ability to confirm the long-term rates on a project is really critical. So, Melissa?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. I think the overall purpose of this legislation was really to give developers some certainty, particularly as they're trying to get financing and get shovels in the ground to do these projects. So this Senate Bill 1883 locks in your impact fees for 3 years after adoption. It requires independent audits of those impact fee programs. You can see it mandates a supermajority vote of 2/3 of the city council for any fee increases. It applies to all city and counties that charge impact fees for new development. The local governments that are proposing these increases must also make the two work products, their CIP and their land use assumption reports, available for 60 days prior to a hearing. It also requires that the impact fee advisory committees have more industry representation on them. It increases it from 40% to 50%. So look for opportunities for those of you in the industry to volunteer in your local communities serving on those boards. Local governments can no longer use their planning and zoning commissions in place of having an impact review committee. So they will all have to establish those impact fee review committees. And the required independent audit, local governments will be allowed to use some of those impact fee revenues to pay for them. Russell, you want to go to the next slide? So as I mentioned, it's going to allow for predictable capital planning and better financing terms, and specifically more transparency. I just want to add to that. that it doubles the amount of time local governments have to schedule the order for a public hearing. So it gives the community and the industry, it was 60 days, it now gives you 120 days to review those proposed changes. It requires the local governments to post those reports well ahead of time. I think it's 60 days for the CIP and the land use assumptions and 30 days for that audit. So all sorts of great information made available to the public. They also have to schedule that public hearing, and then they have to vote on those increases within 30 days of that public hearing. One thing though is that it requires or prohibits governments from increasing impact fees for a period of 3 years. It also allows those local governments to spread those fees, those increases out up to a 10-year period. And so that actually is more transparency and more predictability for developers. Russell, you have anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, just a little note here that as you're working through projects and looking at specific municipalities, what this might mean as we see this implemented is that those increases on a 3-year rolling basis become more significant. In some cases, there are municipalities that already have CIPs in place. Maybe they are already relatively predictable that have been doing things in a shorter cycle with smaller increases. So those deadlines and those borders of the 3-year rolling capital improvement plan are going to be even more critical to understand the impacts to your project and make sure that the timing of your projects gets focused around those edges. In the middle, it'll be very predictable. We want to obviously use that predictability to our advantage, but on the edges, we also want to ensure that we're focused on understanding the impact of the next CIP and how that might impact your project. We're also seeing some application as water companies and utility companies are grappling with this to see if that predictability can include designated increases over the course of those 3 years, as long as they're a part of the plan and voted on, so that they don't all happen at one time. But we haven't seen that totally implemented yet. So a couple things to keep our eyes on as we see this move forward. All right, Senate Bill 15. We'll be talking about unlocking these unplatted rural areas or other 5-acre parcels that have been unplatted. Sometimes these are within city boundaries, but often are along the edges of our larger cities. Again, this is one that is similar. We talked about this being similar to SB 15 when we talked about this SB 15 being similar to the other bill that we talked about a little bit earlier. It is bracketed to those cities and counties with 150,000 people in a county of 300,000 or more, and is also bracketed away from airports and military bases. So again, just something to look at as you start to identify whether this is valuable to you or not. But the benefit here is that for properties that are 5 acres or greater that are unplatted in the past, the cities can no longer regulate forest lots that are larger than 3,000 square feet. So that you obviously, as the market demands, can include a lot larger than that, but they force the codes to be able to develop a 3,000 square foot lot, making projects more dense, more affordable, more flexible for developers. Particularly in some of our smaller communities where there were restrictions on the size of lots all the way up into an acre. This will obviously make the opportunity for some of these smaller, more dense projects, more affordable projects, more applicable and more available. The platting process is more defined. So while you still have to go through the platting process, there are definitions within the bill to define the available setbacks, the size of the lots, et cetera, to just make it a much more clear process moving forward. So a number of things that are included in that is that the minimum lot size is down to 30 feet, and the minimum lot depth, according to this bill, is 75 feet, which means you could have lots that are 3,000 square feet that are either 30 feet by 100 or 40 feet by 75 as your smallest lots. which in a number of the communities in Texas, that would be significantly smaller than their code allows. Again, this has to start out as a 5 acres or more. It has to be within an unplatted area. So oftentimes, even within city limits, you may have a piece of property that's never been platted. This happens. We've done a number of golf course conversions where you end up with significantly sized tracts in an urban environment that are unplatted from older developments. But the intention of it needing to be 5 acres and unplatted is so that they aren't creating these dense neighborhoods within an existing neighborhood immediately adjacent to other things where the redevelopment of a 5 acre parcel that's in a platted subdivision alongside other homes would create maybe some conflict between neighbors, but also some difficulty in things like traffic and utilities in those areas. But particularly along the edges of our communities and the edges in the ETJs and along the city boundaries, there are a number of these types of sites that could be available. Again, mostly it was designed to target the edge of town to create density for affordability that is not too costly or inefficient. The developers can obviously pursue more effective layouts and smaller infrastructure in order to get to these lots and effectively design infrastructure around these smaller lots. Again, it simplifies, I just want to bring up again, it simplifies the standards, including creating limitations on setbacks, parking requirements. It reduces open space requirements to limits that allow for obviously more density and more effective planning. It removes impervious cover restrictions in many cases and defines limitations, expanded height and aesthetic limitations so that there aren't those other ways of limiting these developments through reduced height or reduced aesthetic limitations on the properties. And it encourages affordable housing, obviously something that has been talked about a lot in many of our communities by providing these smaller lots to homes and to developers. So, Melissa, anything to add there?
Yeah, I just want to, it's worth noting that these regulations don't apply to areas within a mile of a law enforcement training campus in a county with a population over 2.6 million. Being from Florida, I'm going to guess that is specific to 1 or 2 communities in the state of Texas. Also not allowed within 3,000 feet of an airport or a military base, nor is it allowed within 15,000 feet of a military base if that base is located in an airport overlay zone. It does where they tried to strike a balance sort of with that home rule authority in local governments. It does not apply to any short-term rental regulations, nor does it affect flooding, sewing, and well water on individual lots. And it does not impact regulations related to stormwater runoff and stormwater mitigation. And it does not affect any deed restrictions that might be implemented by an HOA or another type of property association. And on a fun note, when I noticed when I was looking at who spoke in favor of this, if any of you are looking to hire some young, bright minds, the student body president at Texas A&M, actually, and another leader in the Texas A&M student government also, they both testified in favor of this bill. So you've got some young students paying attention to land use regulation. My guess is they're going to be looking for a job, not to start any battles between who's better between Texas A&M and Texas, but thought that was interesting to note. Thanks, Russell.
You bet. I do want to just reiterate what you said, Melissa, about deed restrictions. We've already heard a number of communities reach out. I think deed restrictions are going to become more and more critical as you guys develop projects. Just something to think about as you're looking at your next projects. Provide the guarantees or the comfort that maybe some groups want and strike that balance, like Melissa said. We've had some folks reach out and want to continue those conversations as well. Next, talking about SB 6, which a little bit of a shift away from housing here, but one that's in an area of really substantial growth, not just for Texas, but around the country as people grapple with industrial growth and particularly data center growth. It's the fastest growing real estate development trend in the country and has been for a couple of years. Obviously, Texas has grappled the last couple of years since 2020 because of freezes and now because of data center growth with some needs to better understand their electrical infrastructure grid. And so this bill from the Senate will require that all industrial projects requesting 75 megawatts or larger to provide a load study that assesses those energy needs that is done in partnership with the provider, whether it's a large municipal provider or a local co-op. You'll need to work with the provider to develop these load studies. A number of reasons for this is that as ERCOT, who's our state level electrical regulator, has noticed that there is quite a bit of speculation and duplicate commitments at a state level for very, very large users. And when we say 75 megawatts here, there are users requesting, 10 and times this and more that are requesting it from 3 or 4 places at one time to trying to find the best solution for them. And the need to track that and ensure that we're not double counting that on a large state scale. The previous ERCOT study showed that ERCOT was planning for tripling the energy capacity that was needed over the next 8 to 10 years. And once they worked out through some of the duplication, that was actually still very large. They likely need it to double, but you can see why planning for triple versus 2x would make a pretty sizable change in the investment that's needed into the grid. So they just need better tracking for this. They need to better understand it. It also pushes the integration of this energy question much, much earlier in the site selection process. This has typically been something that's been determined on a project basis deep into site selection, and particularly in large municipal areas. The abundant availability of electricity has caused the site selection process to focus on other things. This is going to encourage, and in some cases, bring electricity to the fore as the primary reason for site selection as a part of these studies. And also it supports the coordination, obviously, with the local utility to get the planning out there, more than just the single peak use, but how is that peak use going to be applied? What is the load study, and when is that load going to be requested so that projects can be developed in order to continue to encourage business development? The state does not want to limit what is coming to the state, but be better prepared to plan for it. This is something that for many of you, if you're working in larger municipalities, may have already seen over the last couple of years be a request of your area, but this is now going to be codified at a state level where it's going to happen in each municipality or co-op around the state of Texas. Obviously, why it matters, yes, it does improve the visibility statewide for industrial energy demand. It allows ERCOT and the providers of electricity to better plan for these large loads that we want to come to our state, but also need to make sure that we can continue to provide power to everybody around the state and all the different users around the state of Texas. It also allows better agreements to be put in place with those users around when power is available, what is the path if there's a struggle to deliver power, who gets that power. All of those rules and regulations in many cases were not well defined in the agreements, but will be required to be well defined in the studies. The studies have clear documentation that's required at the state level that will include documenting when power will be available and when it won't, how quickly the power is available, the projects that are necessary to deliver the power, and there are other items that are going to be mandatory in these reports. It's also causing, because this is so early in the process, people continuing or seeking temporary or permanent on-site generation as a part of this, not because of this bill, but this bill is highlighting that and is causing those decisions to be made earlier in the project, which again I think is both good for the project, but also good for our grid and good for our state to be more prepared. It is oftentimes a cost, but those higher costs are often borne by projects that can afford them and make the entire grid more resilient and more effective. And then once we're into the process of actually seeking permits, seeking platting, seeking other decisions to integrate these projects into the community, that the power is already determined. We're not getting projects that are getting stuck under construction or partway completed because of the power is not available or wasn't well defined, which has happened in the past couple of years. So that should streamline that process as well. Melissa?
Yeah, I don't have anything specific to add about the language in this particular Senate bill, Russell, other than to just let our viewers or attendees know that it's no secret improving the energy grid is one of the top priorities of Lieutenant Governor Patrick. I think you're going to continue to see more forward motion in this area. This is not a county by county race in the state of Texas. It's not just a national race, and where these data center and these large users end up. It's being shaped as an international race to position the United States as one of the top leaders in the data center development. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for those of us on this call to make sure that we're going out into our communities and just educating the population on what it really means to have one of these large users in your backyard. We're seeing some communities embrace them with open arms, and we're seeing just within the last week a community in Texas that the city council voted against a data center project because of so many questions that their constituents have. So I think there's a lot of room for us to work together with our communities, with our local electeds, and educating them on the myths and the facts around data centers and large use energy projects. But certainly just keep in mind that this is an international race and why Texas is making it a priority.
So as we wrap up from these bills that we've talked about so far, we're just going to provide a little bit of a summary and an impact on what it means for developers and engineers as they move forward with projects. Melissa?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I don't want to rehash every point, but just in summary, this legislation is going to reduce your rezoning delays, help make for faster conversions without those not in my backyard fights, and allow you some financial and transparency predictability with those impact fees and what your projects are actually going to cost. Just keep in mind, we're working in an environment where the local electeds aren't real happy with a lot of this. So being able to find some commonalities and ways to work together will be important. And I do expect to see more of these preemptions on local decisions coming forward in the coming sessions. But good for developers all around. Russell, you want to talk about new opportunities?
Yeah, sure. So new opportunities, obviously, these two Senate bills provide new opportunities for clear land policy along the fringes of our rural and suburban areas, or even some unique infill opportunities. Obviously, some clear direction on the electrical grid and how these industrial projects are going to impact. It consolidates the way that these projects are going to move forward with large loads, instead of having so many different routes to a solution in different locations. It'll provide a more consistent path to those being not known and approvable in these communities from a power standpoint. And then what's, if you're on as an engineer, what does this mean for you? For those of us who've been doing this for a few years, along with the last legislative session, which also made some inroads into attempting to be more clear and cut red tape throughout the state of Texas, this session they made the same attempts here. Most of this has not been applied yet in many of our municipalities. I have seen the city of San Antonio apply a few things and a number of other small municipalities, but it still remains to be seen how this is going to be applied on a code level. They continue to be developed at local codes that need to be approved. Another thing for those engineers that have, obviously been doing this for a long time, this provides a number of unique routes to a solution for your project. In the due diligence phase, identifying what's the most effective path. Do we stay in the ETJ? Do we leave the ETJ? When is the water and power costs going to be implemented? When are the higher impact fees? So In many cases, can we utilize a conversion that we talked about in this presentation today to make a mixed use or a new land use possible? In the past where there may have needed to be a rezoning, there may not. And so just being clear on investigating your projects early on, finding the clearest path to a solution for the project and for the community, and then defining those areas where there's new predictability, like the fees that we talked about, versus maybe some new creativity in these mixed use urban infill projects that maybe we didn't have before. But identifying within your communities or within your city how they're applying those rules and what properties are impacted. I'd continue to watch closely how your municipalities are applying these. Melissa made a plea earlier to talk about being involved at all levels. A lot of these are going to require our knowledge and expertise to be implemented and to be utilized. Get involved in your local community, get involved in these impact fee committees. Make sure that they're getting wise counsel on how this is going to impact us as engineers and our projects as they move forward, so that there's smart application of these codes at the state level. And then how can WGI support you? Obviously, we talked about it at the beginning. As a multidiscipline engineering firm, we have really, really unique tools. If you heard something in this presentation about these bills that may make your project, whether it's easier or more complicated, our planners and engineers have been deeply entrenched in these communities for a long time. We have really tight relationships with the utilities and the cities that can help you investigate and adapt your projects to these new rules, and ensure that if there are unique opportunities available to you on a project that maybe didn't work just a few months ago, as of September 1st, these rules are state law, but may still need some applicability through cities to make them feasible. So if you're looking at a project like that or just have some additional questions, obviously we're going to move from here to Q&A. We can answer some of those now, but we'd love to have you reach out to us to do some analysis or modeling for your projects as they come forward in the future. Thank you.
All right, everybody. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. There's a couple already that we can go ahead and ask. Starting with Blake's question, does 840 only apply to the reuse of existing structures, or does it also apply to new construction that abides by the 65% residential requirements?
I am looking at that bill right now, and at first glance, I believe it only requires to the existing. And Russell, I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
It's geared towards existing structures being adapted. But if you have an existing commercial use that is being underutilized, and in that case, it may very well mean that it's a empty piece of property. This doesn't limit you from using it for new construction. Some of the benefits in the new state code are geared towards utilizing existing infrastructure within the site. So maximizing existing parking, utilizing existing impact fees. So if those things haven't been done, if that paving's not there, if those utility connections aren't there, there's a little bit of the value of this that may be lost. But if you have an unused commercial zoning that you've been trying to move into multifamily for some time, and maybe have had conflicts, or you haven't found the right tool, my understanding is this tool would allow you to do new construction. You just may not get the full value of utilizing existing infrastructure that's described in the bill. But good question.
All right. So there were two House bills that weren't discussed. Do you guys have anything to talk about when it comes to HB 1522 or 2464?
Not off the top of my head. You're throwing a curveball to a government relations person who likes to make sure she's read the whole bill before answering a question. But If Daniel, if you want to get the person who's asking that question their email, I'd be happy to correspond with them. But give me a chance. I'd rather review the legislation and give a correct answer than try to guess on something.
Yeah, we could dig into that a little bit. I know 1522 is about the Open Meetings Act. Melissa, I was taking some notes on that from another meeting that I was in. And so that does, if you're looking at going into a public hearing, it does shift the requirement of the public hearing to have a longer runway. So instead of 72 hours, it has to be 3 business days. And so if you're going into a public hearing where maybe you would have notified on a 72 hours over a weekend or on a Friday, those are going to need to be pushed out because the weekends are no longer going to be counting, or holidays will be counting on those. So I think that is something, if particularly again in smaller communities where they may not be as tightened up on some of those regulations, you may want to just keep an eye out and make sure you don't create a situation where you're non-compliant. The other one, I'm not totally sure about, but we certainly can dig in. So,
Daniel, what was that other bill number?
It was 2464. So we have another one from Mark. Are you aware of any state EV parking space mandates that might be coming?
I haven't heard of one. Melissa, I don't know if anybody from your side has tipped you off on the political side, but from an engineering perspective, I haven't heard of any mandates for that. Mm-hmm. There are certainly communities that have that encourage it through making it easier to add, or maybe even provide some cost sharing for that. But sorry, Melissa, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, actually what we're seeing is quite the opposite across the country. We're seeing a lot of EV mandates either overturned or preempted. I think it's part of the new, the president's administration. One of his priorities is to kind of move away from those types of mandates. And we're certainly seeing that in Florida. And I think that you won't see Texas being a state that puts in any electric vehicle mandates. Certainly incentives maybe, but even then you're seeing grants clawed back at the federal level that have to deal with EV infrastructure. So I'm not optimistic about mandates coming out of this legislature.
And then I guess, can we talk a little bit about the implementation of any of these SBs or HBs at a municipal level?
Sure, I can start, and Melissa, you can tap in here too. The one major municipality that I've seen really tackle this head on was the city of San Antonio, which obviously I'm sitting here. I've been in a number of the committee meetings. This is my home base, but they have sought to tackle these quickly, try and get ahead of them before September 1st. And what we've seen, particularly with the zoning regulations that you saw changed, is that they have, as of, I believe it was the week after this went into effect at the state level, so the week of September 7th, 8th, 9th, somewhere in there, their city council adopted changes to the zoning code specifically to allow for HB 24, SB 840, and SB 15 to be implemented. And what we saw there is that I would say they essentially wholesale accepted those expectations, changing their code to where their smallest zoning, I think, was 3,500 square feet. Now they've gotten it down to 3,000. They obviously have some creative zonings that are even smaller than that. They changed some of their setbacks to match what was stated here in these bills. They changed the language of their zoning code for heavy industrial and light industrial to specifically define where these conversions were from SB 24. So the rezoning conversions, you have to be 3,000 feet away from heavy industrial. They changed their code to specifically define what heavy industrial is, so that it was clear where that was allowed and where it wasn't. And in their case, they actually added provisions to state that, general office, light industrial, and commercial zones were available for this conversion. So we've seen that there. What I've seen in some of the other communities is they're really wrestling with how this impacts the structure of their planning. And so they've gone into planning meetings to try and determine it, but I haven't seen any large communities adopt it other than San Antonio so far.
Yeah, and it's not surprising. Local governments, much like state governments, don't like to be told what to do by the federal government or preempted. Local governments don't like to be preempted by the state. So I think when you pass some of these bills, they'll always try to look for a loophole. Sometimes they find one and then it gets preempted in the following session. So it'll be interesting to see how this is interpreted statewide. I did want to follow back up, though, on the question surrounding Senate Bill 2464, unless I wrote that number wrong. That was a bill related to the establishment of a school safety and mental health grant program. It was introduced, but it was never heard in committee and it was never passed by the legislature. So if I got that bill number wrong, let me know, but I just looked it up real quick.
All right. And then going to SB 6, how do you see that applied at a project level for large power users?
Yeah, so this is one, particularly in our large municipal areas where there's a large municipal utility, is we've actually seen them start to apply this as of 6 or 8 months ago. I think the majority of them expected SB 6 to pass and really wanted to get ahead of it, and it was something that they felt was really needed. They were drowning in requests and were really struggling to get through them without creating a process. And so we've seen that on a project level, most of our large municipally run electrical groups have already gone to a study method. One of the things to look for is many of them are requiring a fee, where those studies were originally, or the designs were originally free. And part of the intention of that fee is just to weed out some of the speculation, but also because they're hiring new staff to prepare for these planning efforts. And so it has pretty significantly changed the process of how we investigate site or put together site investigation, but also organize our projects. Where power was done significantly after design began in the past, it's become the primary gate through which we need to pass in order to start design on a project. For whether it's civil design or entitlements on a new project. Where we've seen that be different is in co-ops, where co-ops have a significantly more limited resources to absorb this request. Most of them run on most of them don't control their own generation. They run on a much smaller budget, on a much smaller staff. Many of them are having to rely on hiring outside consultants. So if you're an electrical consultant that understands, generation design, transmission design, and tools like that, this is likely a windfall opportunity for those folks to go build relationships with co-ops that need someone to help them put together these planning these planning documents for the state. And so in many of those areas, we've actually seen some heavy delays at a project level at this point as they work to implement the studies that are needed for the state of Texas. So, obviously, depending on your electric provider, it could be something that's creating significant delays, but also would give you major assurance once you have that agreement on what the cost and the project timelines are for your project all the way through. We haven't seen one go to fruition, but the benefit of a multi-phase project is that you're going to have a design. We've seen designs come through that are for the full phasing of a project, so it's not going to change after phase 2, where you're going to have to, go back to the drawing board on infrastructure, which is a wonderful change on electrical compared to the past. So those are some of the changes we've seen on the project level that have helped us, better define the power needs. But depending on the location of your project, it may be concerning.
Very good. And then one last thing, actually, we've got a couple coming in here. Have you seen an influx of folks using approved SB 2038, in parentheses, release from the ETJ?
Russell, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we've seen attempts. We've seen a couple released from the ETJs. I would say that there's a few limitations there. If you're within, I believe it's 3 miles, if I'm remembering correctly, from a military base or from an airport. So many of your municipalities have large swaths of their ETJ that are you can't request out. So particularly, I think about the city of Austin, where their airport is on the boundary of their city limits. There's a large swath 3 miles from that you're not allowed to request out, according to the way that the code is written. If you're in a position like in San Antonio, where there's 5 military bases, it essentially covers the town and the ETJ to make it very difficult to remove yourself. So we have certainly seen people working on it. We've seen a few get released. I think it's the way that counties and cities have created interlocal agreements. In many cases, the value of relieving yourself from the ETJ is very minimal. And so I wouldn't say we've seen a flood of them. It's certainly a tool that we use in our due diligence to identify if it can make a difficult project more easily developable. But I wouldn't say we're seeing a flood of them.
And then lastly, if you guys don't mind leaving us with what your outlook is for the next session, some of the results, something that we may see in the future coming on land development in Texas.
I'll just do that. A little inside baseball. I don't see the legislature easing up on making it easier for developers to provide large-scale projects, improve the electrical grid, being able to provide housing and increasing that inventory. I think you're going to continue to see a struggle between the more urban and suburban areas and the rural communities trying to protect the rural communities. You're also operating in a more hyper-partisan environment, which could have the effect of making trying to get anything done possible. What we've seen so far is 2 special sessions since the regular session ended. One was focused on congressional redistricting. The other one was focused mostly on providing flood relief to the communities that were devastated by flooding earlier this summer. You'll see a lot of eyes watching how those appropriations are spent and how they're spread across Florida, Texas, and making sure that those projects that need to get done and those flood warning systems are up actually happen. So those are some of the things that I think you'll see in the coming year. How many more special sessions the governor calls is probably up for debate, particularly coming into an election year. That always makes things a lot more interesting. But what you will see in November is a referendum with 17 ballot initiatives. Some of those we should be paying close attention to, particularly in the engineering industry, on how they fund the additional sales tax revenues for water infrastructure up to $1 billion. So some of the things that we'll be paying attention to here in the industry and at WGI, so that we're better informed and prepared for our clients. But also want to give a thank you to ACEC Texas and the Peyton McKnight and Scott Stewart for all the updates that they give us throughout regular sessions and special sessions. It makes our job easier. And that's it. That's all I've got. So thank you for everyone participating. And Russell, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, just like Melissa said, we look forward to connecting with you. Obviously, we're continuing to track a number of things here, and we may need another 1 or 2 of these before the end of the year to talk about all the things that are going on. But we certainly appreciate everybody's time. We thank you for being good partners to us and us being good partners with you. And we look forward to talking with you about anything we can help with in the near future. So thank you all.
Thanks everybody for attending. There will be a follow-up email sent out to everybody by tomorrow. Thanks, Russell. Thanks, Melissa. We look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks.